Okay, well, can I welcome everybody here? I'll just introduce myself at the start. I'm Richard Burden. I used to be a member of Parliament, and when I was a member of Parliament, I chaired the Britain-Palestine all-party parliamentary group. I still am a member of Caabu, and I'm also vice chair of Labour Friends of Palestine and the Middle East. Welcome to everybody for joining us in this briefing on the impact of Israeli military detention on Palestinian children. I'm really pleased that this is being hosted, and thank you to them, to Caabu, the Council for Arab-British Understanding, to Lawyers for Palestinian Human Rights, to Defence for Children International, and to Save the Children UK for making today possible. I don't think I will ever forget my own first personal experience of what the reality of Israel's system of military detention actually means. I went on many visits to Israel and Palestine with Caabu and Medical Aid for Palestinians. One of those visits was in 2010, where we were taken to Offa prison, which is just outside Jerusalem. And it's inside that prison that Palestinians who are arrested in the West Bank are taken to be tried, whether they be children or whether they be adults. It's one of the most high security places I've ever been to. As you turn up there to visit the prison, you're allowed to take virtually nothing in there. You go through x-rays and all sorts of things. Really, really high security of going in there. And yet when we went in and we were then taken into one of the courtrooms, I was astonished, horrified to see a 14-year-old boy being brought in leg irons. This is a place where he could not have escaped from anyway, in the middle of a high security prison. But honestly, a 14-year-old being brought in leg irons was something that, to all of us witnessing it, was absolutely horrific. Just as horrific was the prospect of seeing his mother sitting there, able to see what was going on, but not allowed to communicate with her son. Indeed, there was at one stage where those of us that were watching this particular case moved out of the way so that she could go to the front rank of the visitors gallery in that trial, to be told that she couldn't sit in the front rank, she had to sit at the back. Utterly horrific. Now, the following year, the year after my first experience of what military detention meant and what those military trials meant, a delegation of 9 senior UK lawyers actually went to the occupied territories to look at and do a study on the treatment of Palestinian child prisoners. Their conclusions showed that Israel was in breach of several counts of the United Nations Convention on the Right of the Child, and also on several counts in breach of the 4th Geneva Convention. Not only was their treatment of Palestinian child prisoners in breach of those conventions and laws, it was also discriminatory. A Palestinian child living in the West Bank comes under Israeli military jurisdiction. An Israeli child also living in the West Bank in an illegal settlement comes under Israeli civil jurisdiction that those same lawyers said broadly conformed to the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, the very thing that was being broken in respect of Palestinian child prisoners. Now, those lawyers were meant to go back a year or two later, having made their report, to see what progress had been made by the Israeli authorities in actually mending some of the problems that those lawyers had identified. That second visit never happened because the government of Israel withdrew cooperation from that delegation, so they were not able to go back to see what had happened. What I can say is that on my further visits to the Offa prison since that time in 2010, and I've made several, the kind of thing that I saw then remains broadly unchanged to this day. So that's the reason that we're talking about this today. That's the reason for the meeting. Just to say something about the progress and running order of today, in a little while, we'll hear from Save the Children UK. Then we will hear from Defence for Children International. And thirdly, we'll hear from Lawyers for Palestinian Human Rights. After we hear from our speaker from Save the Children UK, we will hear from two Palestinian young people who have been through the Israeli military detention system. Their names that we will use today are Hassan and Yusuf. They're not their real names. We have guaranteed that we will protect their identity, but there is no substitute for hearing from young people themselves about what the Israeli military detention system actually means. After we've had the speakers, there will then be some time for a Q&A session. There's a lot of people on the call, so it will be impossible, sadly, for me to keep an eye on all your videos on screen. So if you would like to ask a question, if I can ask you to put that in the chat, and then we'll hopefully take the questions from the chat and I'll come to you as far as time is available. If I can just repeat also what Joe said at the start, if I could ask everybody to stay on mute unless you're speaking, that will make it much easier for the rest of us. And those of us that have got dodgy internet connections, it'll help with that as well. Now, I described what I saw in the Israeli military courts. Appearing in an Israeli military court is not the start of most Palestinian children's experience of living under military rule. There's also a day-to-day reality. And yesterday, the Israeli Human Rights Organization, B'Tselem, published a video online of what that day-to-day reality means. That video was taken in the South Hebron Hills yesterday, where a group of children aged between 8 and 12 were collecting artichokes near the settlement, the illegal settlement of Havat Ma'on. Two settlers arrived to find them doing that, and they called in the army. The video that B'Tselem took then records what happened to those children. I think it speaks volumes about why it's important that we have this meeting. It speaks volumes about why it's important for us to speak out. So before I come to Claire from Save the Children, we thought it would be useful for people who have not seen it just to see that video. So Joe, if I can pass over to you to show the video.
אתם פושעים, אתם עושים עבודת פשע בגלל מתנחלים מחוות מעון. بس يجي ابوه بس يجي ابوه يجي ابوه هو جاي انا ما بدي انا مش فايش انا فاشل
So that was yesterday in the South Hebron Hills. Shocking, but sad to say, a scene that is not unusual. So our first speaker today is from Save the Children UK. It's Claire Nichol. Claire is a conflict and humanitarian advocacy advisor. She works primarily with the team working in the occupied Palestinian territory and on global advocacy efforts. She used to work in Ramallah in early 2020, and there she was the prime author of SAVE's recent report, Defenseless, the impact of the Israeli military detention system on Palestinian children. That report was based on Claire's first-hand experience. She witnessed, as I did, children being sentenced in the military courts. She also interviewed former child worked in a number of humanitarian contexts, including Yemen, Syria, Iraq, South Sudan, and Somalia. Claire, we very much look forward to what you have to say. Claire Nichol.
Thanks so much, Richard. And I'd like to start by saying an enormous thank you to Caabu for hosting this briefing. And it's just a real pleasure to be on a panel with Salson and Tarek too, whose work I admire so much. So I have about 5 minutes now to talk through the findings of the report that I wrote with you. I'll try to keep this very brief as we have Yusuf and Hassan on the line, as Richard mentioned, two young men who directly experienced the detention system as children, and I know that we're all eager to hear from them directly. But before launching into the findings, I'd just like to quickly remark on the video that Richard just showed now and how sadly very familiar it is to me. I've heard a version of that so many times when I was interviewing children in the West Bank last year. This is what childhood under occupation looks like. It's not just checkpoints and walls and movement restrictions. It's children's constant and very legitimate fear that they will be taken from their beds at night or taken while they're collecting artichokes or while they're sitting in the classroom. In short, I want to emphasize that this system, which we're about to hear more about, is a core pillar of Israel's occupation. Now, on to the findings. Last year, Save the Children spoke to 470 children across the West Bank, all of whom have been detained between the ages of 10 and 17 years old. What the children told us is that they experienced ill treatment at every stage of the detention process, almost without exception. This includes widespread use of solitary confinement, physical assault, and emotional abuse. And this starts from the very moment of arrest. 99% of children had their hands restrained behind their backs, mostly by painful plastic ties, and they're blindfolded or hooded. They're generally really outnumbered by many soldiers, regardless of the child's age or size, as we saw in that video actually. And more than half of children are arrested during night raids at their home. And just to give you an idea of what this actually looks like in reality, children described being pulled from their beds by heavily armed soldiers, taken from their homes in front of frightened younger siblings. Children told me again and again that they had no idea where they were going. They had no idea what they were meant to have done wrong or when they might be going back home again. I'd like to quickly read out a quote from a boy I met, Salem, who was first arrested at age 12. He told me, at 2 a.m., soldiers destroyed the main door, entered my room, covered my face with a bag and took me away. They told my father that I'd be back the next day. I came home after 12 months. And from the moment of arrest, children are rarely read their rights, including their right to silence and to legal assistance. And 2/3 of the children we spoke to are transferred out of the West Bank into Israel. And this is in violation of the 4th Geneva Convention. Now, during the interrogation, more than half of the children we spoke to were threatened with harm to themselves or their family if they did not provide either a confession or information on another child or another family. And many children were also signed confessions that they couldn't understand as they're written in Hebrew, a language they did not speak. And generally, children are going through all of this alone. They don't have a lawyer present, they don't have a parent present, and all of these experiences are really terrifying for young children, or any child actually. And our research also unearthed an absolute litany of ill treatment that children who are sentenced and then incarcerated endure, such as being held for prolonged periods in solitary confinement, being tear gassed in their cells, and having dogs set on them. More than 8 in 10 children we spoke to were physically beaten at least once during detention, and for many this is a regular occurrence. And I think unsurprisingly, these experiences take an enormous toll on children's health, both mental and physical. 6 in 10 children told us that they never felt safe again after release. They said that they felt depressed, anxious, and scared, and this distress often manifests in physical symptoms such as uncontrollable shaking, insomnia, chest pains, numbness. Abdullah, a 10-year-old boy that I met, was so distressed by being detained at school that he now refuses to go back to school. He speaks with a stutter and he physically shakes whenever he sees a soldier. And those of you who are familiar with the context of the West Bank will understand that you can't really go far without seeing or encountering some military personnel. And children who have also been detained struggle to reestablish their relationships with friends and family after release. 9 in 10 of the children that I spoke to said that they felt completely alone after release. And of course, this isolation, this breaking of their normal relationships really compounds everything they're going through, all of the distress, because they have their support network ripped away at the very moment they need it the most. I'm conscious of time, so I'll wrap up there. This has been very much just a snapshot of what detained children face, and I'm sure Yusuf and Hassan's testimonies will give a much clearer picture of life in this system. But just to quickly conclude, I wanted to emphasize that international law is very clear on this matter, and I'm sure it's something that Tarek will expand on later. The children must only ever be detained as a measure of last resort for the shortest time possible, and the prohibition against ill treatment is absolute. All of the evidence, and there is so much of it, so much evidence, shows that this system is not rooted in these principles, and in fact, often the reverse happens. And after our research, I think we can also definitively say that the children who experience the ill treatment that has become a real hallmark of this system, bear the mental and physical scars of their experiences for many years to come. So I hope that this report and the reports of other organisations such as those on this panel, as well as War and Want, who recently published an excellent report, serves a bit of an alarm bell. It shows why this system must be dismantled and why no child should be prosecuted in military courts. But I will pause there.
Thanks very much, Claire. Thanks for your presentation. And again, huge thanks from me also to Yusuf and Hassan for sharing your experience with us. And thanks also to our interpreters today. Our next panelist is Sausan Bastawi, who is the UK Advocacy Officer for Save the Children International Palestine. She's worked in both Ramallah and the UK for Defence for Children International Palestine. And she also works with DCI colleagues in New York on their global advocacy campaign, No Way to Treat a Child. So Defence for Children International, Sausan, over to you.
Thank you so much, Richard. So, as Richard said, my name is Sausan, and I'm the UK Advocacy Officer at DCI Palestine. We're a local Palestinian charity and the only one that focuses specifically on protecting the rights of children. We extensively document the Israeli military detention system, as well as things like settler and soldier violence, threats to the right to a childhood, and that includes documenting how the occupation and its components like checkpoints and demolitions and settlement expansion and the closure of Gaza impacts education, housing and health as that relates to children. But today, of course, we're talking about Palestinian children in the Israeli military detention system, whose experiences we document through the collection of sworn affidavits and interviews, and to whom we provide legal representation. So specifically, I'd like to talk a little bit about the outbreak of COVID-19 and some of the longer term implications on children, which Claire has touched on already. So the outbreak of COVID-19 introduced additional risks to the well-being of Palestinian children in the Israeli military detention system, in addition to the numerous forms of ill treatment already mentioned by Richard and Claire, and so eloquently illustrated by our Palestinian guests. At DCI, we confirmed 3 cases of COVID-19 in Palestinian children in Israeli custody since the outbreak of the pandemic. According to our documentation, Palestinian children in the Israeli military detention system have long lived in close proximity to each other, often in compromised sanitary conditions. They typically have little or no access to resources with which to maintain basic hygiene practices, including practices that reduce the spread of COVID-19. So in these conditions, the chance of virus propagation is obviously greater, and these children are at a heightened risk of contracting COVID-19. In March of 2020, we called on Israeli authorities to immediately release all Palestinian child detainees in Israeli prisons due to the rapid global spread of COVID. And in May, 3 UN officials also called on Israeli authorities to do the same. Nonetheless, Israeli authorities have continued detaining Palestinian children. And according to information provided by the Israel Prison Service, at the end of September, 157 children were in custody, 2 of them in administrative detention, which is a form of detention without charge or trial. About 3/4 of these children were unlawfully transferred into Israel, and the transfer of children to facilities in Israel constitutes an unlawful transfer in violation of the 4th Geneva Convention and a war crime in violation of the Rome Statute of the ICC. Unfortunately, in August, we then confirmed the first case of a Palestinian child detainee who was 15 years old in Israeli custody infected with COVID-19. At the end of September, we confirmed a second case, and in January of this year, we confirmed a third case. Both those children were 14 years old. Several other Palestinian children detained since the outbreak of the pandemic have told us that soldiers did not take precautionary measures to reduce the spread of the virus. They did not wear masks or gloves. The children were not medically examined or tested for COVID-19 upon their arrival at facilities. They were often transferred from facility to facility without being tested. They were often placed inside rooms, including with other children, that did not contain cleaning supplies, hand soap, or adequate ventilation. Worryingly, 1 of 3 Palestinian children currently held by Israel under an administrative detention order is additionally vulnerable to the effects of COVID-19. Amal Nekla, who is 17 years old, was arrested during a night raid on his home in January in Ramallah. He was then sent to a military court where his detention was extended for 72 hours. And then on January 25th, a 6-month administrative detention order against him was issued and accepted. He's currently detained at Megiddo prison inside Israel. Amal suffers from something called myasthenia gravis, which is a rare chronic autoimmune and neuromuscular disease that causes muscle weakness, including in the muscles used for breathing and swallowing. He requires ongoing, uninterrupted medical treatment, and he has to remain under constant medical supervision since complications associated with myasthenia gravis are often sudden and life-threatening. Research shows that people with his condition are at a greater risk of worse outcomes when they're infected with COVID-19. Until now, Israeli authorities continue to ignore demands for Amal to be released urgently. So as Claire mentioned already, the psychological implications are obviously profound and can be long-term on children who have been detained in the Israeli military detention system. These are often exacerbated by insufficient specialized mental health and psychosocial support services. But traumatic arrest and detention experiences don't just adversely impact the psychological well-being of children, but also their educational development, which Hassan touched on. So the Israel Prison Service educational program for Palestinian children is paltry and it's punitive. It doesn't respect the right to compulsory education for Palestinian children, and it doesn't correspond with the Palestinian curriculum. The classes are infrequent, they're often limited to maths and Hebrew or Arabic. There are often no textbooks, and they're not grade appropriate. So children might be learning in a class with children who are 4 years older or younger than them. Consequently, Palestinian schools count days spent in Israeli prisons as absences, and as Hassan mentioned, he's very lucky that the Ministry of Education didn't require him to then repeat a grade. Such inadequate education obviously obstructs the ability of Palestinian children to successfully reintegrate back into their schools and their communities once they're released. Some of them drop out of school, others are forced to repeat a grade, all of this while carrying the invisible burden of their trauma, and symptoms of PTSD might impede a child's ability to focus and learn. Nightmares and sleep disturbances are commonly reported to us as well. So we see clearly that Israeli authorities' denial of education for Palestinian child detainees, in addition to the other forms of ill treatment that leave psychological damage that we've heard about today, only prolongs the suffering of children who we think should not have been detained and tried in the military court system to begin with. I'll stop there because of time and I'll hand back over to Richard. Thank you.
Thanks very much indeed, Savsan. Our final panelist is from Lawyers for Palestinian Human Rights. It's Tarek Shreru. He's director of LPHR. For those of you that don't know, LPHR is a charity that works on legal projects to protect and promote Palestinian human rights. Before joining LPHR, Tarek worked as a solicitor. He specialised in asylum and human rights law, and he co-managed the Public Legal Advice Service of Liberty. He holds an LLM in Public International Law from King's College, London. Tarek, over to you.
Thank you so much, Richard, and thank you for everyone who's part of this call this afternoon. I'd like to particularly thank Hassan and Yusuf for their very powerful testimonies, and it's so important to hear. It doesn't. Every time I hear testimony from a young person, child who's been through the military detention system in Israel, it doesn't. I'm always very moved, and I get frustrated because there is no progress being made on this issue in the UK or internationally. And I think that maybe is a good starting point for a conversation, for a wide conversation that goes beyond this meeting, but this meeting can help inform that conversation. I'd like to just make a couple of very quick points, and then I'd like to move into a Q&A so that you all have the opportunity to ask us questions, and more importantly, allow Yusuf and Hassan to speak further. Number one is that what you've heard from Hassan and Yusuf is multiple violations of the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. And a basic principle underlying the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child is that the best interest of the child should be the primary consideration. The best interest of the child should be the primary consideration of the authorities. Israel ratified the convention in 1991, and it appears clear that they are not abiding by their responsibilities under the convention. And this has been found by the UK lawyers, the senior UK lawyers report that came out in 2012, which is now 9 years old. And this report made 40 recommendations. Hardly any have been implemented. UNICEF came out with a report a year later making the same number of recommendations. Again, no implementation. So I think we're now at a stage where I'm going to speak specifically about the UK government, but it's a message that War and Want, Save the Children, DCI, LPHR, that we all are converging on, which is there should be a fundamental assessment right now as to whether Israel is willing to fundamentally reform their military custodial system that tries and that detains children, arrests and detains children. If they're not willing to fundamentally reform their system, and the evidence is very clear that they're not, despite the huge opprobrium that followed the UNICEF report, there were no fundamental changes came out of that. If they're not fundamentally willing to change, then I think we should be calling upon the UK government to take a position on the military court system itself, and to say that the system should not be used to routinely try, detain and try children and civilians more generally. And that should now become a message that UK government takes forward alongside their positional settlements. So I think there's a linkage that can be made there. UK takes a very strong position in its opposition against settlements. They say that it's illegal. They don't recognise settlements. They recognise that it's unlawful under international law. And I think the UK government should be taking some of the position in relation to the military detention system. It's fundamentally unlawful how it operates to try, detain and try children and civilians. So I'll stop there, and thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Tarek. We were scheduled to finish this call at 3 o'clock. I think we've probably got flexibility to go on for about a quarter of an hour, but as we move into the Q&A, if I can ask people, if I do ask you to ask your question to be as brief as possible. With luck, I think we should have time to cover 3 areas in the Q&A if people are brief. So I'll take a couple of questions that have come in on each of the first the areas. The first one is on the trauma suffered by Palestinian children in Israeli military detention. The second area is on the experience of detention, the amount of rearrest, and whether pressure is put on children to act as informants. And the third area is what we can do in the UK, what UK politicians can do, what the government can do to perhaps follow up on that original lawyer's report. So if I could ask people to be as brief as possible. So if I can perhaps first come to Ronald Mendo. I know you've asked a question about informants, but could you perhaps first ask the question on psychological trauma that you put in the chat? Over to you, Ronald.
Thank you for giving me the opportunity to ask these questions. Obviously, the mental anguish described by Hassan and Youssef were very moving. So I wanted to know, was there any assistance given to child detainees who've experienced the trauma in terms of mental health counseling? That's my first question.
And also in that category of questions, Maggie Foyer of the Olive Harvest Trust had a question. Maggie, are you here?
Yeah, hi, thank you. Yes, what we're trying to find ways of providing assistance. We have some money and we're looking at things like circus skills, something practical, something that can help integrate, particularly the kids who have to come back a year later, which is so embarrassing and destroys their self-esteem. Some sort of practical way we can offer assistance.
Okay, thanks very much. Well, perhaps I can come to Claire first on those. First of all, on psychological support for children that have been through or are going through the system. And secondly, from Maggie, are there other practical ways that we can help?
Yep, sure. And thanks for both of those great questions. First of all, on mental health support, yes, absolutely. That is something that we prioritize. We work through Save to Children, through partners such as YMCA in East Jerusalem, to provide both individual counselling and group therapy for children who have passed through the system. As we heard from Youssef and Hassan earlier, and as Sausan said too, the psychological impacts are broad and far-reaching, and it is not an immediate fix. It is something that these children live with as they live with the continued occupation around them, as soon as they are not removed from the experience. We often talk about PTSD in our conversation around mental health in the UK, but actually we talk about complex trauma quite frequently with Palestinians because there's no post their trauma. They don't get to leave the situation. They are always at risk of being arrested again or seeing their family or friends arrested again. So they live with this forever. So this mental health support is absolutely critical. I would like to emphasize that, as well as the huge impact of these experiences on children, I was also blown away by the resilience and hope of every single child I met who are determined to be good citizens and to fight for the rights of themselves and other children. They just need the right support to do so. So we are very proud to work with them and to provide those skills in both the mental health and education sectors. In terms of providing assistance, and perhaps this is one we could pick up after this call and discuss in more detail. But yes, I mean, the other area that we personally provide assistance in is in vocational skills, as well as catch-up classes. As you said, children who are out of the education system often have to move down a year, for example, or they feel that embarrassed because they've missed out on so much of the curriculum that they drop out of school. out of the children we spoke to, 8 in 10 were enrolled in school before they were detained, and that halved to 4 in 10 after detention. So you can see that enormous impact. So first and foremost, we try to get the children who would like to get back into school to be at that level, to work with them, provide catch-up classes. But then for older children or those who no longer feel that's the right fit for them, we do also provide vocational skills. I'll be happy to chat with you further after this event to discuss details of what that might look like in different areas and what's the most appropriate support.
Thanks very much indeed. We've had 3 questions come in on the second area I was talking about. So I'm going to come to Bruce Stanley to ask his question. Then I will ask Vivian Kinross to ask a question on the Palestinian Authority's involvement and ability or lack of ability to do anything about this. And thirdly, Ronald Mendel, who asked a question before, if I can translate your question here, Ronald, as you've spoken one, he asked the question is, during the interrogation process, is there any pressure put on detainees to serve as informants for the Israeli government? So perhaps we can ask Hassan or Youssef if they're able to comment on that, and then perhaps come back to either Sausan or Tarek on that. But Bruce, if I can come to you to ask your question before we get the answers on that.
Very quickly, I'm interested in how the system comes to the children over and over again, a kind of a churn, a carceral churn that brings them and keeps them into the system. They release, they're arrested, they're released, they're rearrested, and so on. And that increases the impact and demonstrates the systemic nature of the racism involved in the project.
Okay, thank you. And the last question in this section from Vivian Kinross, and I think this one is probably for Tarek. So Vivian, are you there? Okay, well, let me translate Vivian's question. Said, could we have a legal perspective on why the Palestinian Authority Security Service and police have no authority over the arrest and detention of children in Ramallah and other areas of the West Bank that are under the control of the PA? Thank you. Tarek, could you come back on the issue of the PA about, and the question there was, again, why they don't seem to have any authority of the arrest and detention of children in Ramallah and other areas of the West Bank that are under PA control.
Yeah, thank you, Richard. I have to confess I won't be able to give a full answer in relation to this question. All I can say is that the West Bank's under military occupation. It's subject to all protected persons under occupation are subjected to Israel's under Israel's occupation, is subject to their military law and military orders, and it's enforced by Israel's military, and that includes criminal offences, certain criminal offences under Israel's military orders. I'm sorry, I can't go into more detail on that.
So, okay, well, perhaps we could come on to our third area of questions now. And this was, we had a question from Jean Fitzpatrick, also a question from Salma Hamid, and also a question from Paul Hughes Smith. Perhaps we can start with Paul, who's going to ask a question about follow-up to the lawyer's report from 2011-2012. Paul, are you there? Can you ask your question, please?
Yes. Yeah, I was appalled at the chaotic and inhumane conditions that children were subjected to. And I've written to my MP and sent the reports, the original report, which was funded by the FCO, and then the subsequent reports by UNICEF and Save the Children. But I'm wondering what more we can do to get the follow-up to the original legal team that went and with the 40 recommendations and how we can get that. I mean, I was slightly answered that by Sir Vincent very kindly, who said we should do this through our ambassador in Tel Aviv. But I don't know whether Tarek has got any more suggestions on this front.
Thanks very much, Paul. Jean, would you like to ask your question, Jean Fitzpatrick?
Yes, I'm not quite sure which one it was, Richard. I'm actually quite despairing, and I just want to know what parliamentarians will do, can do. We all know what the situation is like. These brave young men have spoken to us today so powerfully. We can't keep meeting like this, doing reports, doing briefings, doing webinars. Something has to change, and I'm just wondering what our panelists think will bring about that change amongst parliamentarians to hold Israel to account who are behaving illegally. Thanks.
Thanks very much. Well, we had a similar question from Sama Hamid. Sama?
Yeah, hi there, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for arranging this, and thank you to Hassan and Yusuf for their accounts. I agree with everything Jean just said. There's no point in my mind for reports and recommendations if nothing actually is no action is going to be taken. And my question was very simply, how effective are MPs in demanding accountability for the treatment of these Palestinian children and indeed all the Palestinian people who are being oppressed at the moment? Thank you.
Thanks very much. Perhaps I'll come back on a couple of those at the end, but could I ask if any of our panelists would like to comment on any of those questions?
I can speak briefly on the follow-up report. Sorry, I don't want to interject. Did someone else want to speak?
No, please do, go ahead.
All right, you go ahead first.
Okay. Oh, sorry, Claire. Please do come in.
You're on mute, Tarek.
You're muted, Tarek.
Sorry, my apologies. My apologies. Yeah, you may be aware that there was a planned follow-up delegation due to go out in 2016. And this was announced by Tobias Ellwood at a parliamentary debate in Westminster Hall in January 2016. The delegation was due to go out in February, the following month. And the purpose of the delegation was to essentially review whether the first report's recommendations had been implemented. And so when this announcement was made by Tobias Ellwood in Parliament, I won't go into the details, but essentially it became clear that Israel would not facilitate the delegation as far as they would not provide access to their officials for the lawyers to interview in relation to the implementation of the recommendations. So the follow-up, so the delegation did not go ahead, and it's been frozen ever since. And as far as I'm aware, there's no impetus within the Foreign Office to revive it. It may be that parliamentarians may want to push this, or but at the moment there's no interest in going forward with it.
Thank you, Claire.
Yeah, I was just going to come in on the general question on what can we all do and this stasis of any sort of progression. And I absolutely share your frustrations. When I was writing this report last year, I was looking at older reports from UNICEF, from Save the Children, from DCI, and I saw that the situation had either remained the same or deteriorated. The recommendations were the same as they were 5, 10, 15 years ago. I think my personal view is that it, of course, comes down as always to the question of political will and the lack of accountability measures used against Israel. We know what the issues are. It's well documented. As I said in my presentation, we know what the issues, there's plenty of evidence. And we know that also states are raising it privately with Israel, which is commendable. But raising it is not translating into change. We've seen decades pass without progress, and ultimately this stasis is harming children. In short, there needs to be accountability. I think Israel's cost-free violation of children's rights and cost-free occupation must end. I think this is the only way in ensuring that in another 5, 10, 15 years from now, we won't be gathering yet again to discuss this same issue. And that's not just the UK alone, of course, that's the entire international community who I think must act with unity and with conviction to bring about any sort of changes. And I think one element that would help with that is knowing that the UK public feels strongly about it. We can't necessarily expect them to do the right thing of their own volition, otherwise they would have done it by now. They need to be made to care, they need to feel the pressure to change their current policy of inaction. And I think that's something that all of us on this call can really engage in, can sort of raise with their parliamentarians too. So I think we all have a role to play, but we've got to bring this momentum forward now.
Thanks very much, Claire. Sam, would you like to come in on that issue, with those issues at all?
Yeah, I completely agree with everything that Tarek and Claire have said. And I just wanted to add that in the US, where there's significantly less support in Congress than we have in Parliament, and we know that there is so much support in Parliament, we were able to push a bill through that essentially prevents US taxpayer funding from being sent to countries that, any country, not just Israel, for the purposes of militarily detaining children. And in the UK, we don't really have an equivalent piece of legislation that we can target, because in the UK, our relationship with Israel is governed mainly through, for example, international convention and treaty rather than through legislation. That, combined with the fact that Brexit and COVID-19 have really dominated the legislative and political agenda for the last few years, means that the responsibility is for us as organizations and you as campaigners or individuals to get really creative about how we actually apply pressure on the UK government to see this as a priority issue, and we need to really elevate the status of this issue so that it gets the attention that it deserves. And I think that, you know, I feel really optimistic about that. You know, as organizations, we're working to present a really strong unified voice to the government, and what we need is for supporters also to be very loud about this issue. And I think that, yeah, I see lots of reason to be hopeful. Personally, it's just, and I think that really actually what it comes down to is what Tarek mentioned earlier in this call, which was it's going to begin with the UK government admitting and acknowledging that this issue is, or the military detention of children or civilians is unacceptable. And it will begin with that, because it's only if they admit that and they accept that, that I guess we can kind of work on, okay, well, what's the UK government's kind of role in ending that? But it will begin with what Tarek suggested earlier, which is that the UK government will really need to make a statement to that effect. And so we all need to start applying pressure on the government to do so.
Thank you very much indeed. And can I say, as somebody who worked in Parliament for many years, I absolutely share the frustration that everybody has said about the fact nobody can say we don't know what's going on. It's been witnessed by large numbers of MPs now. It's been the subject of reports by senior lawyers, by organisations like DCIP, like Save the Children, and many, many others. And the government will itself acknowledge that what has been happening for decades now is unacceptable. Somehow what we have to do is to build up the pressure that it's not enough to note the breaches of international law, that we've got to ensure that those breaches of international law lead to consequences. And there is a job of work to be done with ministers over here to get them to recognise that and to act on it. But I mean, I can say what is really, really important in that is public pressure. That's why meetings like this are very important. It's why it's really important that all of you are as loud as possible in reminding politicians that this has to be on their agenda and that you want to see action taken. In that context, perhaps just before we close, I could ask Sir Vincent Feen to come in. Sir Vincent was UK Consul General in East Jerusalem some years ago, so we'll have some personal experience of what pressure works and what pressure doesn't always work so well. But he's now the chair of the Balfour Project, who've got an initiative coming up, which I'm sure will be of interest to people on this call. So Vincent, if I could ask you to just say a few words. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And thank you to everybody who's participated in this very moving and important hour and a bit, particularly our two Palestinian speakers who experienced so much harm. On pressure, I think that what you said earlier, Richard, is correct. There is a need to get this back on the agenda and higher up the agenda of our MPs. And if I can put it this way, to embarrass our government into action. Back in the time when I was Consul General in 2011, this delegation of jurists and judges, very senior, very impartial, came. And at that time, the Justice Minister of Israel was Tzipi Livni. She allowed them to come. She listened to what they had to say. She received the report. As we know, virtually nothing has changed. I'm very grateful to Save the Children and to War on Want and to DCIP for keeping up the pressure, keeping up the flow of factual information. So I have a suggestion, which is a bipartisan approach by Conservative MPs, Lib Dems, SNP, Labour, to Dominic Raab and James Cleverly after the Israeli election, which is later this month, to say, please ask for a return visit of the new Israeli Justice Minister, whoever that may be, likely to be centre-right. And if that is refused, to move to the point that Tarek said earlier about equating the treatment of children and the breaches of international law that it entails currently with settlements. But I come back to your, finally, I come back to your point, Richard, consequences. Without consequences, I do not think Israel will change policy. So it's up to us to try to ensure that our government, with all the other preoccupations it's got and its disinclination to challenge Israel, should be embarrassed into so doing. And the first step would be to ask for a return visit to Israel and Palestine by a legal delegation funded by FCDO to check on progress or total lack of it since 2011-12. I will just add one sentence, which is, it's important that those who are on this call and those who are sympathetic should write to their MPs, should draw attention to this briefing, should draw attention to the crimes that are being committed, and should not take no for an answer from their MPs. Thank you.
Really good advice. Thanks very much, Vincent. Okay, well, just before we close then, could I thank all of you for being on the call, to thank our panelists, Sausan, Claire and Tarek, and particular thanks to Hassan and Yusuf for sharing your experiences with us. You are with friends here and friends that will continue to take up this issue because it is so important that we do so. Before I finish, I'd just like to ask Joe Willits from Caabu to close the meeting and also to say a couple of things about some other activities that Caabu will be organising in the coming weeks. So again, thanks to Caabu, to Save the Children, to DCI Palestine, and to Lawyers for Palestinian Human Rights for putting today on. And thank you to all of you for your attendance. Thank you. Over to you, Joe, to close the meeting.
Thanks, Richard, and thank you to Claire, Tarek and Sausan, and in particular Hassan and Yusuf. I mean, it's really very important that we hear from young Palestinians and Palestinians generally in terms of the experience they go through. And this is why also our delegations to the region are so important in taking MPs and bearing witness to some of the issues that we're discussing. And this is an issue that at Caabu we've long dealt with. I mean, whether successfully, judge for yourself. But thank you all for being part of today. We have another couple of events on Palestine that are coming up. They are on our website, but I will send out links to everybody probably tomorrow. But we have an event that we're doing together with PSC on whether, the discussions about Israel being an apartheid state, which we're doing with Haggai Elad, who's the director of B'Tselem, the Israeli Human Rights Organization, and lawyer Diana Boutou. And then also on that's on the 22nd of March at 6 o'clock UK time. And then on the 25th of March, we also have an event on COVID-19 and higher education in Palestine, which we're partnering up with our friends of Birzeit University. So please do join us for those. They're on our website. And also a final sort of push, which we always have to do, particularly in these times. But if you feel inclined to, and you agree with what we're saying, and you support our work, and you appreciate these briefings, then please do consider supporting us, whether becoming a member or financially or however way you see fit. But we really do appreciate the support, and obviously events like this are really, really important, and we hope to be able to continue to do them, whether in a pandemic or otherwise. But I hope you all stay safe, and thanks again for joining us this afternoon.